Hello, everyone. So my name is Joanne Kennedy and I'm a naturopath in Sydney, Australia, and I specialise in methylation and histamine intolerance. And today I have with me my colleague, Melanie Peers, who specialises in oxalates. Now, oxalate toxicity will drive histamine intolerance in a really big way. So today's chat is going to be about oxalates and how they drive chronic inflammation and histamine intolerance. So welcome, Melanie.
Hi, thanks for having me.
You're welcome. You're welcome. So, Melanie, I just want you to start with explaining and giving us a bit of a story into your journey to specialising in oxalate toxicity.
Okay, I think with a lot of practitioners, for me, it was I actually lived it myself. You're part of that journey. So I actually saw you as a patient about 4 or 5 years ago. My histamine intolerance was through the roof, but nothing was really working. And then you talked to me about oxalates. And I was like, what are you talking about? We didn't learn anything about this in uni. So I went deep diving into all the information about it and realized there's this whole world about oxalates. And this was a large part of my problem. So yeah, lots and lots of research, lots of watching webinars, and now I've lived it. So now I help others that have oxalate issues too.
Yeah, so can you just explain to everyone what oxalate toxicity actually is?
Okay, so that's probably the correct term, because with oxalates, they are actually toxic to the body. So oxalates are crystals, they're sharp crystals in plant foods. There's varying amounts in different foods. But when oxalic acid binds with a mineral like calcium, they form these crystals, and they're very, very tiny, but they're very, very sharp. So when we're consuming these foods, our body can only deal with so much. We can't detoxify them, we can't break them down. We have bacteria in our gut that can do that, but only to a certain extent. And then anything else will become absorbed into the bloodstream. So we'll either pass it through into the stool or we will absorb it into the bloodstream, because they are so tiny that they can get through those tight junctions, even if you have an intact gut.
Wow.
If we've got a leakier gut or permeability, we'll have more of a problem. So they're just very sharp and they cause a lot of damage to tissue once they're in the body. Probably the most famous oxalates would be kidney stones. That's what most people know about. It's what most doctors know about, is these calcium oxalate kidney stones. But these oxalates can actually be anywhere in the body once they get into the bloodstream.
Okay. So Mel, tell us where they are most likely to end up in the body, and what symptoms do they cause?
Okay, so they can end up pretty much anywhere, as I said, because they are so microscopic, but particularly oxalates like connective tissue. So you'll get it in joints, tendons, places like that. Any injuries that you have, you'll be much more prone to oxalates storing there because the tissue is already weak. You can have it in like the synovium fluid. You can have it in any of your organs. So thyroid, sex glands, adrenals can be very targeted. But any tissue in the body can be affected. It can get into the cells of any part of the body.
Wow. So what are the main symptoms that will...
Okay. Well, there is a huge, huge amount of symptoms that you can get because it can be anywhere in the body, and everyone will present a little bit differently based on where their kind of body weakness is. So as I said, like you've got that injury that never heals, it could be because the oxalates have stored there. But what we're looking for is someone with gut issues, plus if you've got like neurological issues or pain issues, which can be hard because when people have histamine intolerance, they have lots and lots of symptoms. So the ones that really drive it for me is joint pain that comes and goes. Anybody who says the better I eat, the worse I feel. So they're eating really healthy anti-inflammatory foods and they start to feel worse. But I'll go through a few of the body systems and what some of the symptoms can be. So digestive, you might have like excess belching, bloating, IBS type symptoms where you have changes in your stool. You can have like really loose yellow stools that can sometimes burn when they come out. Gritty stools, if anyone's looking that closely, it looks like there's little bits of sand in the stools. You can have any kind of inflammation or pain. So that's a very general term, and inflammation is such a big word because it just can be anywhere. But like anywhere where, as I said, like joint pain, you've got like sinus pressure or congestion, you can have it built up in there, rashes that come and go. Gosh, the list is endless. Neurological, you'll see like irritability, depression, insomnia can be a really big one. Histamine intolerance, it really just like comes and goes, and you're like, I can't figure out why I'm on this low histamine diet and I'm fine, and then all of a sudden my histamine levels go through the roof. People will sometimes experience that. Urinary symptoms will be things like interstitial cystitis, anything that feels kind of sharp, painful, uncomfortable. Sometimes might even feel like thrush, and you get tested and there's nothing there. You get cloudy urine, any kind of like burning or irritation upon urination, any like kidney problems like lower back pain, you might feel like your kidneys are hurting. And then musculoskeletal can be one, like really tight sore muscles anywhere in the body, but like maybe like in the neck and the shoulders, people get it there. Creaking joints, weakness in your muscles, grittiness in the eyes, like sometimes you feel like you might have sand in your eyes. Gout can be actually like a precursor.
Oh, okay.
So oxalates is like a precursor to gout. So if someone who's susceptible to gout, you might want to look at oxalates. So yeah, lots and lots of different symptoms.
What we'll do, Mel, is we'll put all those symptoms in the show notes, I think, so that people can actually look at all these symptoms that seemingly seem unrelated, but can simply cause some oxalates.
Yeah, when you know what you're looking for, you can see the pattern. But if you don't know about oxalates, it'll just seem very random. Things don't make sense because symptoms will come and go. And as I said, people will say, I feel much better when I eat a burger than when I eat a salad.
Yeah, that's a real telltale sign that there's something.
Yeah.
So who are the population groups that are more susceptible to getting oxalate toxicity?
Okay. Anyone who has gut issues, so you've got that permeability in the gut, because then there's more that can get in. Anybody who is eating a high oxalate diet, and there are certain diets that can push people into more of a high oxalate intake. So like if you go on a ketogenic diet, for example, you're removing a lot of vegetables from your diet, you might start eating lots of the leafy greens like spinach because it's low in carbs, something like that, or gluten-free because you're switching to something like quinoa, which is gluten-free, non-grain, which is actually high in oxalates.
So some of those spinach is high in oxalate too. That's right.
Yeah. And a paleo diet, because people like, we love a paleo diet, but I think people are trying to fit an ancient diet into modern living. So they want to bake lots of things, and they're making things with nut flours. So they're eating a huge amount of nuts, which can be high in oxalates. And I think it just comes back to everything in moderation. People are eating these really high diets because they think more is better, like these anti-inflammatory foods are better, but it's all about variety and keeping it in moderation. So those people will be at risk. Someone with mold exposure might be more likely to get oxalate issues. Your kidney function's not great because our body will excrete some through the kidneys. If it can't get rid of it through the kidneys, it will persist in the body. As I said, gut inflammation. Fat malabsorption is another one. So if your body's not absorbing fat, that fat will bind up to calcium and magnesium. And what normally happens is if you're eating oxalate-rich foods, the body will, in the gut, the body will bind the oxalate to the calcium and it will more easily be excreted from the body. If that fat malabsorption happens, it's taking all the calcium and the magnesium that's not then binding to the oxalate to try and get rid of it. And then some supplementation can be problems for some people. So vitamin C, the ascorbic acid, collagen, xylitol, or any glycine supplements, because the body, during the process of breaking those down and metabolizing them, can create oxalic acid. And then there are some deficiencies that will actually cause the body to create more oxalates, because we do make oxalate. It's called endogenous production. And we should make it at low levels, but when you have like a B1 or a B6 deficiency, that tends to drive up that endogenous production even more. And a sulfur deficiency can really let the oxalate get into the cell because they share the same transporter. So you've got oxalate floating around, and instead of the sulfur getting in, the oxalate can go in there instead because there's no sulfur to compete with it. So yeah, there's a few things. And just generally, a really high oxalate diet will do it to anybody.
I want to get back to the sulfur thing in a minute, but first of all, Mel, what are the things people should be looking for with fat malabsorption issues, and what's going to drive fat malabsorption? Because I've seen, definitely, I know ketogenic diets can do it. I've seen it with patients who have developed oxalate issues from ketogenic diets where they're eating a lot more fat than their body can handle.
Yeah, well, if the body's not absorbing fat, you might see like floating stools. They might be pale. You might see some oiliness in the toilet afterwards. But if your gallbladder and your liver aren't functioning really great and you've got issues with your bile, that will be a problem. But then it also comes back to these diets that are extreme, like they're not keeping things in moderation. So that's part of the problem. I think as humans, we're very keen on, some is better, more must be best. So they really go to these extremes, and sometimes they're needed. But yeah, if you're eating too much fat and your body's not coping, you might have like nausea, feeling a bit sick after those fatty foods. That might be one of the symptoms. But yeah.
So I guess people who've had gallbladder removed are more at risk.
Oh, absolutely, because those people really do struggle to digest fat properly. But any sort of digestive issues can slow down that process of the body, even releasing the enzymes that you need to break down the fats as well.
There'll be lipase as well, so pancreatic enzymes as well.
Yeah.
And SIBO. So I believe that SIBO deconjugates bile acids, which renders them unavailable to bind up fat.
Yeah.
So it's coming back to the whole gut being out of whack can majorly cause problems with oxalate.
Absolutely. And that's the thing, the people that have these issues are generally the ones that will present to clinic and will say you've got an oxalate problem. There can be people wandering around and they've just got some niggling problems that aren't necessarily bringing them to us. But it's those people in particular that it becomes really obvious and really problematic. Yeah. They really struggle.
Yeah. So Mel, the whole issue with sulfur dumping, I think that this is what we are calling it, sulfur elimination in the urine from oxalates, is a massive problem for human health.
Yes.
Sulfur is the second most abundant in the body, in the element in the body. It's extremely important for detoxification, the production of glutathione. So can you explain to everyone what is going on with the oxalate sulfur transport train that I like to call it, and what happens to sulfur with oxalates, and why is it such a big problem?
Okay, so it's like a catch-22, and you get caught in this like cycle that sometimes it's the sulfur deficiency in the beginning that causes the problem, and then the problem then becomes even worse, or the oxalates cause the sulfur deficiency. So what happens is, to get into the cell, we need these transporters to get in, and oxalate and sulfur use the same one. And so when you have a lot of oxalate in the body, what I probably should have mentioned previously is that part of the reason that the body puts oxalate into your tissues is because it's so incredibly toxic, it needs to be out of the bloodstream. So it will put it anywhere, even though it's going to cause damage where it's putting it somewhere that it's going to cause a little bit less damage. So it will put anywhere it can to keep it out of the bloodstream. So they share the same transporter. So if there's a lot of oxalate, the body's going to prioritize putting the oxalate into that cell. And then the sulfur is going to be out in the bloodstream, which sulfur shouldn't be in the bloodstream on its own either. Yeah. So what will often happen is when it gets to the kidneys, it will get wasted. It's called sulfur wasting. So, and again, because if the oxalate's there, that transporter issue, the competition occurs, and the body will be wasting sulfur, and it becomes this really tragic situation where you're so desperate for sulfur and your body's wasting it into your urine when you need it the most.
So this causes issues with methylation because it will drop your homocysteine levels. So can you just explain to everyone what homocysteine is doing and why it's going to be reduced with a reduction in sulfur? If you wait for sulfur, what will happen with homocysteine?
Yeah, so one of the telltale signs we'll see, and you'll flag it on an organic acid test if you see somebody on a blood test, if you see really low sulfur, homocysteine, is that's a sulfur issue. So, the sweet spot's around 6 or 7, anything that goes below that, we know that there's likely a sulfur issue. And that's because the cysteine component of homocysteine is sulfur-based. And the body becomes so desperate for sulfur that will start breaking down those amino acids to use it. So it's using that cysteine and pulling it down to use that sulfur to make glutathione, because the body is so desperate for it. So that's one of the telltale signs that there's a sulfur issue. When there's a sulfur issue, there's usually an oxalate issue.
So everyone, if you're seeing homocysteine levels anything less than 6, it's a really big red flag for issues with oxalates and mold, basically.
Yeah. And in extreme cases, you'll start to see muscle wasting, because the body will get so desperate for it that, you'll start breaking down your muscle tissue to get the sulfur amino acids out. And you might even start seeing that you stop tolerating sulfur foods and you feel terrible when you have sulfur foods. And I know this is an oxalate talk, but it creates such a problem for sulfur. And
it's completely linked. I my understanding is that the gut microbiome will actually start making sulfur. I've read and then you've got all this sulfur in your gut, but it won't go, it's not going into the cell because the oxalates are hogging the transporter, and then you're just wasting more sulfur, but then you can't tolerate sulfur foods.
And then you cut sulfur foods and you make the problem worse.
Yeah. These are the people that have multiple food intolerances. They'll be intolerant to oxalate and histamine and sulfur. And then, Mel, what happens when there's problems with sulfur and salicylates?
Well, they'll come together as well, because you need sulfur because you've got to understand everything in the body needs to be broken down, whether it's a natural substance or not, and detoxified. And that's the same thing with salicylates. They need sulfur. So when you lack sulfur, you'll start reacting to salicylate foods because it can't be broken down and processed correctly.
That's right. So salicylate intolerance is often driven from an oxalate intolerance in the first instance. Yeah. Okay. Interesting. So, Mel, how does a low oxalate diet differ from other elimination diets?
Okay, so with a normal elimination diet, you would get a list of foods that contain that compound, and you were told to avoid those foods, like go on a low histamine diet. And what we do is we try and remove as much as we can to get a good baseline, because if you react well, we know that's definitely the problem. The problem with oxalates is that because when you have oxalate toxicity, the body starts to store it into the tissue. As you reduce your oxalate intake to a level that the body can tolerate and process, it will go, great, we can start getting rid of this stored oxalate. And it's called dumping, which I think is a bit of an unfortunate term, but it'll start dumping the oxalates out of storage, and you can actually make your problems worse. So some people might hear about oxalates and go, great, I'm going to go on a low oxalate diet. They might even go really extreme and go on a carnivore diet, which is meat only, because it has no oxalates whatsoever. But if you do that, you can make your problem actually much, much worse. You can end up in hospital if you do too much damage to yourself. You can find yourself in a world of pain. So it's a very gradual process. You need to slowly reduce. And especially if you're someone who's been eating lots of these amazing health foods, like bags of spinach and lots of sweet potato because you're trying to go low carb, if you reduce them too quickly, the dumping will occur. So we say about 5 to 10% per week, you try and reduce your oxalate intake very, very slowly to get where you need to go, because anyone who has been through a heavy oxalate dump will tell you that it is not fun.
Oh, it's awful. And it will really stimulate your histamines, won't it?
Absolutely. And that's why I was talking before about people will say, I'm on this low histamine diet, and suddenly it starts to flare up. That can happen usually just before an oxalate dump. You'll find your histamine levels go through the roof. So I found before I was having an oxalate dump, I would start to get insomnia and wake with heart palpitations. That was how the histamine presented with me. And I just kind of felt a bit puffy. That was another presentation that I had. So you might find that your histamine levels, go through the roof. And another thing, that rash that you think is like a histamine rash could actually be oxalates coming out through the skin.
Wow.
Because the body can do that, which has happened to me. It's pretty wild.
Wow. So Mel, Charles, you can see little crystals coming out of your skin.
You can, yeah.
Is it painful?
I did it in a slow enough manner that no, it wasn't painful. It was a little bit of irritation. I kind of describe it like if you're at the beach and you have some sand and it's kind of grating on your skin a little bit and you get a bit of irritation. This kind of feels like that, but it can be painful. And if you Google some images, you'll see some pretty big crystals coming out. There's some wild out there, yeah.
I might do that when we finish this chat. Okay, so you're discussing dumping. So can you explain to everyone what the difference between dumping, accumulation, and mobilisation is?
Yep. Okay. So accumulation will just happen if you're eating a high oxalate diet and more is coming in and the body can release into the stool. So you're starting to accumulate oxalate. It's getting into the bloodstream and your body's starting to put it into tissues. So you might find that your symptoms of accumulation are a little bit different from your dumping symptoms. So that's where you might get joint pain, headaches, muscle tension, a certain part of the body might be hurting. And then when you get to mobilisation, that's the period between accumulation and dumping. So when you start the low oxalate diet or reducing your oxalate, as the body starts to pull it out of the tissue, getting ready to dump it, that's the mobilisation phase. So you might feel a little bit unwell when that happens too. So you might feel like your joint pain flares up, or you might get fatigued. That's where it's coming out of storage, back into the bloodstream, ready to be excreted from the body. And then the dumping phase is when we're actually excreting it from the body. And there are 3 places that the body does that: through the kidneys, into the urine, through the gut into the stool, and then through like the skin or mucous membranes, which is where you can see it, the crystals coming out of your skin. You might feel it in your eyes, grittiness in your eyes. Some people have it coming in their mouth, in the mucous membranes in their mouth, out of the gums with the teeth, and that's the dumping phase.
Okay. So it's really hard for people to deal with, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, when you know what you're doing, it's not too bad. And I have to say, as far as elimination diets go, the low oxalate diet is not too bad. There are a lot of vegetables that you can still eat. And I always say you can kind of chop and change and choose what foods you want to include and exclude. So if there's one really high oxalate food that you really enjoy, that's like the last one that you start reducing, right? You might reduce spinach first and then say the sweet potato. That might be your last thing. For me, it was my almond latte. That was the last thing that I stopped.
Did you ever have to stop it? Finally, you did the last minute?
No, I didn't have to fully stop it, but I did realise that I had to organise my intake of the day around that if I really wanted to have it. So you can do that. And like if you are celebrating your birthday and you wanted to have some dark chocolate, which is high in oxalate, then you would just shuffle around the other things that you're eating in the day. So it's not as hard as going on a really strict elimination diet where you have to remove all of the foods in that group. You have room to kind of play around with it a little bit, which I think is good. And I always say if you've got very heavy dumping, what you need to do, it means you've dropped your oxalate too quickly. So you have to increase your oxalate intake a little bit just to kind of settle down the dumping. So I always say the antidote to heavy dumping is dark chocolate, and that's no bad thing, right?
Oh, okay. Definitely.
Yeah.
Now, Mel, you were mentioning sulfur, which is can become deficient with oxalate toxicity. What are the other nutrient deficiencies we can see in these patients?
Okay, so any of your minerals, so calcium, magnesium, iron, potassium can become depleted, and your electrolytes can get really thrown out. So that's one of the problems that you can have. Sulfur, iron is another one. I don't know if I said that. And then, they waste when you are dumping. The depletion is your B vitamins. They're the main ones. So B6 and biotin especially, but generally just the B vitamins.
Wow.
So yeah, and the thing is if you're on a dairy-free diet and you're eating all of these calcium-rich plant foods, you need to understand that most of the calcium in those foods is bound up to the oxalates. So spinach is like the star food of being a high in calcium, right? It's so incredibly high in oxalate that not only will it bind to all of the calcium in that spinach, it will bind to calcium that is in other foods within that meal. So
the misinformation out there on nutrition is extraordinary.
Yeah. It's like we forget.
Yeah, I just don't. I think that there's many sort of magazine articles, blog articles written by people that have not been university trained on how to deal with nutrition, and it's quite dangerous. So I do see it in clinic myself a lot. But I think the positive is that you can really use nutritional medicine as a powerful healing tool that can really turn someone's health around. That needs to be done under the guidance of a professional. Otherwise, it can be really dangerous. So I agree. These extreme diets, whatever they are, like vegan, carnivore, even paleo with too many nuts and seeds high in oxalate and spinach, juicing, green smoothies every day, bone broths and the whole fermented food movement, which is all histamine. They are time and time again, we will see people in our clinic that have gone down these pathways and can significantly hinder their health.
Yeah, that's it. And it's because we're not using it in the context of people who have got disrupted gut function, and most people in the modern world do. And it's really great that we want to have this paleo diet. As I said, we both really love the paleo diet, but it's the way it's marketed in the media and the mainstream that's the problem, because people want to start doing all this baking. And you've got to keep in mind that you need to have that to fit, not in your modern lifestyle, but in our modern bodies where we don't have the gut health that the Paleolithic people had. We have a lot of stress, we have a lot of toxins. So you've got to put it in context with that. And the same thing with fermented foods. We have, if we were living, 1,000 years ago, maybe we would be able to tolerate them, but not the way we're trying to now because of modern living. And also just the extreme, again, like some's good, more is better. I have to have fermented foods 5 times a day. It doesn't need to be like that. It needs to be a bit more balanced. So yeah, people, if you don't know, can cause more damage than they realize. Something like salicylate, you know, I've seen article about people who have just pushed through the detox and didn't even realize that it was a salicylate problem.
Right.
And they were poisoning themselves by feeding themselves more and more and more of these healthy foods. Same with oxalates. I've seen people really unwell, really, really unwell, and they were eating more and more and more oxalate foods, not realizing that they were actually causing more damage.
So Mel, actually, just so people can understand, what are the main sort of causes of gut issues are you seeing in clinic? Just broadly.
There's just the modern Australian diet, I'd say, would be number one.
Yeah.
You know, processed foods, toxins in the environment, stress. We don't pay enough attention to stress, and it's not just like extreme stress. I've got a deadline. It's I'm running late for work. I've got a million things to do on my to-do list, not realizing that we're constantly activating that stress response that's supposed to keep us alive, that shuts down our gut function. So, and then a lot of the problems that we're encountering, even some of the gut issues that we're encountering, are because the baseline for gut function is not there. So when you start getting these overgrowth of candida and parasites and things like that, and you can see people on an amazing diet and they still have those problems because the gut foundations aren't there.
Interesting. So, Mel, what are the tests that people can do to look at, to start looking at oxalates? What testing would you do?
So if someone's had an organic acid test that can show it, it's not 100% foolproof. So quite often when you refer someone to me, they've already had an organic acid test, and you can say, Mel, there's 3 oxalate markers on there that can be high, and we know, okay, we're dealing with a problem. But you always want to go through like client history and everything like that and make sure that the symptoms match. But the problem with that one is, so I had my oxalate levels on oat look fine. And it was because my creatinine levels were a little bit low. So they don't adjust for the dilution for that. So it's not foolproof. But if you have an organic acid test that has those oxalate markers that are elevated, then yes, we'll say you have an oxalate problem. So, and then beyond that, it's just very cheap to just try it on yourself. You know, how do I feel when I eat high oxalate foods? Usually when we speak to people about oxalates, they'll go, you know what? I do feel terrible when I eat too many nuts, or this happens when I have black tea, and when I take it out of my diet, this happens. Or when I start eating healthy again, I feel worse. So once you know what oxalates are and what foods they're in, if you have an oxalate problem, it will really start to resonate with you. But please don't go very low oxalate.
No, I've seen that where people will remove way too many oxalate foods too quickly.
Yeah.
I've all the categories of food intolerance. I really genuinely think people with oxalate issues need to be guided by a professional. I really do, because of the dumping that can start to really cause massive inflammation. And because of all the issues that you're depleting your sulfur, and without sulfur, you cannot make glutathione, and you cannot get on top of your chronic inflammation. So it's quite serious. Whenever I see a patient come to me, they might have a very long case history that they've filled out my patient intake form. They'll have genetic testing done, SIBO testing, stool testing, blood tests, and they've done an organic acids test, Dutch hormones, all of these tests. They'll come to me. The first thing I will look for on all those tests is oxalate.
Yeah.
If they have oxalate, that will be driving their chronic inflammation, histamine intolerance, crazy food intolerances, B6 deficiency, which is so important for progesterone production, neurotransmitter synthesis, clearing pyrroles from the spleen. And then if they've got oxalate, potentially it's coming from mold. So this is where you start with these people. Like, that's what you need to look at, in my opinion, because it's driving chronic inflammation and disrupting your biochemistry and your biochemical pathways, your methylation pathway and your sulfation pathway, big time. So these are the people that have tried everything. They've been sick for 20 years. They've done SIBO protocols. They've done gut protocols. They've even been tested for Lyme disease. They've traveled to Germany to look at Lyme disease. They've done everything and they're still unwell. And these people are such a red flag, as this is not just a simple SIBO case, a bit of candida or gluten intolerance. It's much more insidious. So I think that's what you should, like, if it's the chronic nature of it and the seemingly unrelated symptoms, and you never ever really get any resolution from any other treatment you've done.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're right about the guidance, because I quite often, we talk about oxalates in the first appointment when I see people, and if it's a new concept to them, they're just like, oh my gosh, I can't even fathom. So it's really important, because the amount of times they come back, we usually get to like the third or fourth appointment and things have gone a bit funny, and we go, hold on a second, we realize it's something we talked about at the beginning they haven't been following through with, so they need that reminder of what they need to do, or when to start to bring things in. So it can be really tempting to go, oh, I'm going to start supplementing with B6 then, because that's going to reduce my endogenous oxalate production. Can also induce a lot of dumping. So people quite often 3 or 4 appointments in will go, why am I dumping so hard? And then we realize that they've decided on their own to bring B6 in, and you need to know when to bring these things in, because anything with oxalates, anything that can make you feel better can make you feel worse. So some people find B6 really helpful, and other people, it will make them dump harder. Some people will find Epsom salt baths because they've got the sulfur. They'll find that's really helpful when they've got a dumping episode. Other people, 10 minutes, and they can have a huge dump because the sulfur is then pushing the oxalate out with that transporter. So you need to know what you're doing.
Guidance, Mel. Yeah, it does. Out of everything we're doing, I really do believe that.
Even something like exercise can stimulate dumping in some people.
Wow.
Yeah.
Interesting. Okay, so Mel, what are some of the treatment options that you're using in clinic for these patients?
Yeah, so we start always with starting to reduce the oxalate intake very slowly, and I can't give everyone a meal plan and say follow this, because where they're starting from is different. I had someone who was eating a bag of spinach a day. Now, 3 cups of spinach has 1,000 milligrams of oxalate. Our body can process about 100 to 200 grams a day.
Wow.
So this person was having, in just the spinach alone, was having like 5 times what he could tolerate, on top of all the nuts, all the spices, everything else that he was having. So we had to go very, very slowly. Then bringing in minerals to help replenish, because if you've been on a high oxalate diet for a long time, you've got risk of having bone issues. So osteoporosis could also be a marker. If you're young and you've got osteoporosis and you're eating calcium, it could be that the oxalate's just binding it up and it's not ever getting into the bones. So minerals are really, really important. You can use minerals to replenish, but you can also use that as like a binder as well. But as I said, everything has to be done like in a systematic way. You can't just start doing everything at once. You've got to do it bit by bit. So yeah, low oxalate diet, minerals, rest, really, really important. But just, getting the right foods for you. So I find people on a low oxalate diet tend to have to increase their animal protein for a while. I always get the comment, I feel like such a caveman, I'm eating all this meat, but it's because that's what the body can actually process at that given time. So it's a bit of a process. But yeah, rest is really, really important, because your body will be mobilizing oxalates when you're sleeping. And it can take a really big hit to your energy production, oxalate. So that's a really important factor.
Interesting. So the dumping and the increase in histamine is very potentially going to be causing insomnia. So that's something people really need to realize, that you need to sleep.
Yes, absolutely. And exercise might not be your friend. You might have to, depending on how severe the problem is, some people just have to realize that stretching is the only form of exercise that they can do at this point, because they are so chronically unwell. And these are the people that have to just push through to try and cope with life. Life isn't just going to stop So they're pushing through with this chronic illness that they've been suffering with for a very long time. The body's so depleted. So you need to find that balance between trying to heal but not doing too much.
So Mel, just my last question to you actually, and I know we're not really doing a mold today. We're going to do a mold in another interview. But how common is oxalates with mold illness?
I see it a lot. I see people, whether it's because, so there's a little bit of conjecture about Aspergillus, which is a strain of mold, causing oxalate problems because of the metabolism, and it creates more oxalic acid, and whether it only occurs in the lungs or whether it occurs systemically. But I see anyone who has Aspergillus on their organic acid test has an oxalate problem, whether that is specifically the Aspergillus or it's just the dysfunction that's caused in the biochemistry and the gut. It's a very big problem in the mold community. And, you know, I've been through mold myself, and that's where I made the connection. When I started looking to oxalates, I realized that lots of people in the mold groups knew about oxalates, and I thought there's something here. So I've looked into it further, and I see it a lot in clinic, that there's a correlation there.
So one more thing. You were saying this to me the other day. We always thought that oxalates cause candida, but is it now thought it's the other way around, that the body will make candida under duress from oxalate?
Yeah. So that's what we're thinking now. And this is why it's just so important to keep up with the research, because, you know, what we know now isn't necessarily what we're going to know tomorrow. There's a lot more research being done into oxalates, but the problem is it's it affects so many parts of the body that it's really hard to keep on top of everything. So at the moment, a lot of the research is going like in the autism community, and the research has been done around autism because they're finding that link there. But yes, they think that actually the high candida levels is the body's response to the oxalate, and it's an upregulation to try and cope with it, whether or not it metabolizes the oxalate a little bit.
But then they get all the candida symptoms, the brain fog, and
they think it's just they think it's just candida. And what I always say to people, because by the time they come to us and they've figured out they've got candida, they haven't touched sugar or carbs for 2 years. And I say, why do you have a candida problem and your neighbor next door who eats nothing but sugar doesn't? It's because there's regulation issues in the body. Our gut has the ability to keep these things in check, and it has the ability to upregulate them. The candida, and as you said, like with the sulfur-producing bacteria, when you need sulfur, it will upregulate that. It's a very, very intelligent system that our body has, that it has this ability to up and down regulate things according to the environment.
It might be making you feel very unwell.
Yeah.
Problem. So yeah, autistic children will have very, very low homocysteine, like it's 2.5.
Yeah.
Wow, and massive sulfur depletion. Yeah, interesting.
Yeah.
Well, Mel, you're a wealth of knowledge and fascinating, and I'm so glad I've got you working with me to deal with my oxalate and mold people, because it's such a specialised area. So thank you so much for your time today. Everyone, I'm going to put on the show notes what all the symptoms of oxalates are, and so you can actually take a good look and get a sort of grip on whether your seemingly unrelated symptoms can actually be coming from one cause, which we often see with oxalate. So Mel, thanks again for your time, and I'll speak to you soon.
All right, thanks. Bye.
Bye.